First of all, let's take a look at where you're coming from. SharePoint is a fairly large elephant, and many people have seen it from different angles. Let's start with kind of looking at the different ways you may be approaching SharePoint from your past history. If none of these are relevant to you, please bear with me. It may actually be useful for you to hear how other people have seen SharePoint. What we'll do is we'll start with the IT pros. These are the guys who keep SharePoint running, who manage the servers, who are the ones who kind of keep the fires rolling in the boilers. If you're coming as an IT pro, you've probably worked with SharePoint in a number of its different versions and a number of its different configurations. With this background, just be aware that SharePoint has changed fairly significantly in its user interface and a lot of the templates that you're working with, but generally hasn't changed in the basic concepts. SharePoint's basic concept is still the list. SharePoint still works with web parts, but as the plumbing that you've seen come into play with SharePoint over the past several versions has extended, underneath the hood is where you'll see these changes happening. And we'll go through it. You're probably going to be more concerned with the security side of things, probably a little bit less with the templating and the styles, but note that all of this is still ready for you to pick up and go with. As far as the terminology, as a IT pro and as someone who's actually worked with it, you're probably used to things like site collections as opposed to sites. You're used to working with different groupings and different databases. Working with the SharePoint site directly means that you're going to have to take a little bit of a step back from that and take a look at how SharePoint itself is exposing it. SharePoint is a fairly strong interface so that what you see from the user's point of view or from the management point of view inside the app hides most of what you're used to looking at. The servers, the interfaces, the databases, the maybe the load balancers, all of that is really well hidden. So when you're looking at SharePoint, don't start looking at it from a server or a URL location, because a lot of that may change as you're working with the site itself. If you're coming in from a developer point of view, you're probably the one who's most intimately aware of how all the moving parts inside of SharePoint function. You're probably going to be thinking of the SharePoint site as a SP site and maybe a site page as a SP web. All of those object model pieces. It's generally very useful, and you're probably the one who's going to have the most experience with working with the inner workings of SharePoint as a user experience platform. But note that stepping back from that a little bit and understanding that you don't have to have that experience, you don't have to have all of that to really make SharePoint sing, can be a little bit freeing. You don't have to worry about digging through the structure trees or those kind of things. Just look at SharePoint as it exposes things to you, and you'll be a lot more comfortable. You're probably more used to working with things as the front end, as the server, if it's a cloud-based installation or if it's a app model. All of these things are very useful for you to think about, especially as you go through the SharePoint setup. You're probably going to be the one that understands most about templates and the rest. But don't let that get in the way of thinking about the data and the SharePoint site itself as it moves forward. Again, don't get caught up in the details and step back just a little bit and take a look at this from the Gestalt view. And finally, if you're approaching this from a business user or a traditional end user that doesn't really work with the technology as much, you're probably going to have the easiest time kind of stepping into the SharePoint site owner model. Note that you're not going to have the in-depth understanding of what's going on under the hood that the IT pro and the developer generally do, but sometimes that's actually going to help you as you can concentrate on pretty much what's important, which is making sure that the information is secured, is available for your users, they have the right options, and they have everything they need. Coming from your point of view, you're already working with the primary pieces that you need for doing a SharePoint site ownership, and that's knowing the process, what's going on, what workflows do you have, where do things need to be organized and where they need to be found at, how does the user find things by search. All of these things are important for you and are generally things that you've worked with before. Data If you don't have data, then kind of the question is, why do you have a SharePoint site? So you're already looking at that, and you're probably more intimately familiar with the data that you're putting out there than a developer or an IT pro, unless it's their particular data. So be thinking about that. I mentioned in the IT pro section, remember that as you're looking at SharePoint, all of SharePoint is lists. So if you're used to checklists, if you're used to kind of rundown inventory lists, anything like that, you're already thinking in the terms of SharePoint. So as you start working with the site itself, remember, things maybe look a little different. Things may be kind of interesting to see. But at the root of it, you're looking at lists, maybe lists of documents, lists of Excel spreadsheets, lists of items, lists of calendars, lists of announcements, lists of messages. It doesn't really matter. If you're going with that, then you're in good shape. And then there's the organization. And this is the piece that really kind of makes a lot of people sit back and think, where does all this go? With your site that you're going to be working with, remember that you can have multiple sub-sites under there that share a lot of the same components with your site. This is one of those pieces that as we get deeper into configuration, I'll probably talk about a lot more in depth. And that's the blurry line, especially with the SharePoint interface, of what is a SharePoint site and what is a SharePoint subsite. Again, from the developers, you heard me saying the SP site and the SP web. These are actually the different object models that happen in there. And to be honest with you, things can get a little blurry under the hood. Coming back up to the top, there are a couple of clues that will show you on how to keep it all squared away. But if you're doing that organization, remember those lists can actually be separate, or you can actually tie them together. You can group them in your subsites. You can actually tie in information from one to the other and actually have lookups between those. You can actually have data coming from external systems if your SharePoint implementation has that set up. And we'll talk a little bit about that in capabilities. But in general, you're looking at your process, your data, and your organization. Outside of this, there may be some of you who are web developers who are used to things like style sheets, who are used to things like working with custom JavaScript. And with SharePoint 2013, that's a very useful capability to have. With this newest version of SharePoint, a lot of things have been put into the client side as JavaScript. SharePoint is very heavily dependent upon style sheets now, as opposed to earlier days in ASP.NET when things were a little more focused on server controls, user controls, those kind of things. Everything's been very much standardized on an HTML5 interface for the web interface. And again, we'll talk about some of the other interfaces that you may have into SharePoint that may not be web, but even those are going to be fairly well tied in with a JavaScript background. So those are kind of the common directions where you're going to approach SharePoint and become a SharePoint site owner. Hopefully that kind of gives you a beginning place as we dive into the different templates and libraries. Once we go into here, we're going to be jumping back and forth between the PowerPoint that you see on the screen and a SharePoint implementation itself, because it kind of helps to talk a little bit about things and then jump into it. So in the next part, we're going to be going into there and taking a look at actually this tool chest that you're going to have. So now that we talked just a little bit about where you're coming from, let's actually look at the site templates. First of all, let's just figure out what a site template is and do a little level setting. Basically, a site template is a collection of information and lists that you can use to quickly get a site up and going. This template contains everything from default items on a list, lists themselves, web parts that may come from other places, and with SharePoint 2013, even applications that may be installed on other servers or on other SharePoint locations around the globe. So just think of it as a big bag of pre-configured stuff for you to work with. We're going to actually go through some of the ones that you actually get out of the box with SharePoint. Later on in this course, we're actually going to talk about how you can create your own site templates. When we actually go in and look at each of these templates, I will show you when we get into that section a little bit of the refinements about the difference between a site and a subsite. And I know I come back to that every once in a while, but it is something that a lot of people kind of miss until you actually see it in play. So let's start off with just going through the templates that you really kind of get out of the box with SharePoint. Again, depending upon which edition of SharePoint you get installed or what your administrators have given you, you may not see all of these, or you may submit some additional custom templates if someone's already gone through there and created some more, or maybe even modified what you see out of here and put something customized to your group. So the one you see quite a lot is the team site. This template is really built for exactly what it says. While you have project sites, which we'll get to in a second, that are for things that begin, have a middle, and end, team sites are built a little bit differently because they're kind of targeted for teams that come together and may stay together through multiple projects. If you think about this as maybe you have a department where your marketing department, they kind of keep going even though there may be different initiatives. Your IT department may have their own team site even though they've got multiple development projects. It just kind of rolls through there. So when you see the team site, think of something that lasts longer than a specific project. You have the blog site. Lots of people look at this. We found that this one is not quite as useful, mainly because it kind of came out of a big blog push that happened early on in the .com era. But today, most of this functionality is actually put into other sites. You can make this really easily across all of the different templates. So having something that's just specifically for a blog isn't quite as useful anymore. You want something a little more complex, but it's still in there for kind of tradition. Project sites, as I mentioned, are specifically for things like projects. Something that has a beginning, you get everybody together, you want to capture the tasks that you completed, maybe assets across the project, everything kind of gets put together. And then when you wrap it up, you can actually bundle this up, archive it, or keep it kind of together so that you can come back and refer it. Maybe you need it for validation, maybe you need it for compliance, but everything's in kind of one spot. Note that the project site is one of the templates that is modified more than most of the others I've seen, or just about all the others I've seen, because there are so many different types of projects. When we're going through and modifying these, I'll actually show you some places that you can go in and actually reach out to other data sources. One of the nice things that we've done before is going into a project site when a project is assigned in another system, maybe your ERP system or something else. Actually having SharePoint provision a project site and even pull in things like the members who should already be on there, maybe template documents or reference documents that the project will need. Everything's automatically provisioned and put in there. And these are things you can actually do by modifying the templates. But again, it may be something as simple as maybe a software development project has your coding standards included in it automatically, whereas your financial groups project has your accounting references or something like that. So this is the template that tends to kind of spread out into multiple types very, very quickly. The community site. Community site's one of those that actually used to be something built into SharePoint Portal, but as kind of the plugin models come into play, the community site's now available for you to work with to make it easier to manage. But if you think about community site as basically being where you go to find out all the sites in your organization, it lets you slice and dice your different sites, lets you see things where there may be certain tags, where there may be certain memberships, where the hierarchy may be in certain ways. So it's pretty much a discovery so that you can see what projects are going on, maybe what's going on in those projects, give you an overview across all of those. It's got some very kind of customized content in there to help you pull all that in and have everybody kind of have one location to go to. I mentioned one location. That's kind of what was broken out. The reason why you have this as a template now is because it was just one location, whereas this, if you have different departments, different organizations, maybe even different companies underneath the main company, you can actually have them have their own community site, and then those can actually roll up into maybe an overall company site. So it gives you a lot of ability to coordinate and slice and dice how all that information comes together. The Document Center is kind of what it sounds like. This is the location for you to be able to put your documents in, for you to actually be able to have what used to be kind of the old network file share. Again, The document center itself can be duplicated up underneath the team site, the project site, the community sites, all of those kind of things. But this is for one of those places where you've got specific types of documents, you've got something that you're going in, you want things kind of managed under a central authority. And this is one of those places for governance, for accountability, for all those kind of things. This could be very useful for you. It's built to help you with different versions of it, help you track what's going on, who's signed off. It's got some workflows in there to help you work with making sure that the right documents are approved and everybody's signed off on it. So it's kind of the way for you to kind of get those documents, replace that filing system or that file cabinet that you have with a location to make sure you've got the right documents in the right place. Record Center is a little bit different in that this is actually a place for records to be submitted. And again, this may be both documents and record centers. They may not just be Word documents. They may not be just Excel files. They may be image files. They may be emails. They may all these kind of things. But Record Center is actually built for things to be submitted into it and then having those records be categorized. So you can actually go in and go, here I'm putting in a programming standards document and actually have it go into IS standards documents, kind of records, to be able to manage those and be able to put those into place, to be able to pull it out and know exactly what you've got, where you've got it, when you need it. So it helps with a lot of that. This actually ties in with a lot of e-discovery, which we'll talk about a little bit later, as well as how you're putting things in place. Things such as when your lawyers come in and say, hey, there's a lawsuit coming into place, we need to make sure that these documents don't get deleted. We need to know that anything that's being supposed to be destroyed or removed after this date, those are put on hold, and that we can make sure that we've got it there and that we don't get in trouble with the judges, because, well, that's a bad thing to have happen no matter who you are. You've got your Business Intelligence Center, which is actually built into SharePoint to be able to let you go in and do a lot of reporting, do a lot of visibility into how you can slice and dice data. This is one of those places where there's been a lot of different solutions. You need to be fairly technical to go into. SharePoint is now kind of becoming one of those repositories for all of that to come in, so you can actually start letting your business analysts be able to connect in with the data, be able to see it, be able to work with it without needing a lot of technical background. So know that this is where you would go to have your people being able to slice and dice, to make their own charts, be able to connect into data that may be inside of SharePoint, maybe outside of SharePoint and going through the Business Connectivity Manager, or maybe you may actually have it stored in the files themselves. Maybe you have an Excel spreadsheet that you can pull in and be able to do that on. So there's a lot of different pieces in there. We'll kind of walk through it when we look at the template. An interesting thing that SharePoint allows you to do is different types of search. The Enterprise Search Center and the Basic Search Center. Basically, you're looking at these from two different ways. Again, I mentioned that if you've got different types of SharePoint, different levels of SharePoint, you may see one or the other of these. Normally, if you've got Enterprise Search, which is that top tier of SharePoint, which in this one includes FAST and a bunch of other very advanced technologies, that lets you do some very interesting things. Again, if you've gone through the SharePoint Administrators course, we went through a lot of the different ways that you can do things like synonyms, be able to do targeted search results, all of those kind of things. Whereas Basic Search Center is a little bit more focused on things such as just full text search, the names of files, the names of items inside your SharePoint list. It's a lot easier to manage, but you're going to get things pretty much straight up rather than being able to do a lot of tweaking or management of the searches. The reason why you have both of these is both because Enterprise Search is not available if you have a lower level of SharePoint, but also maybe you do want that different way of looking at it with the search centers. Generally, your administrators will work with the Enterprise Search Centers, and generally you'll even have somebody that's maybe your information architect or someone like that who actually does a lot of these kind of search optimizations with Enterprise. Whereas if you're kind of the person that's here as a site owner, you may want to put a Basic Search Center in there so you can actually put it in, not have all this complexity, and be able to do some tweaks on yours and point it to different locations to be able to do searches. It makes things a little bit easier. Visio Process Repositories. This is one of probably the least well-known of the SharePoint sites. I think it's pretty valuable, but basically what you're looking at here is using Visio as your process documentation and your process generation front end. And you have a SharePoint site that actually pulls that out, pulls what it needs out of those process drawings and handles it inside, so that you can actually, instead of having a Visio diagram or Visio process that's tied with just the document itself, you can actually have it inside of SharePoint and then work with multiple people, have it working through that process, be able to be shared, not run into the problems that you used to have, for an example, with Access databases, where it was just one location where you'd have locks on it. This allows you to do those shared Visio processes in SharePoint itself. Then we've got one of the big ones for most organizations is the publishing sites. This is basically the ability for a group to either curate information or to actually generate that information, push it out, and make sure that it gets out to everybody in a very timely and performant manner. What's this different from some of the others I talked about, maybe the team site or the project sites, is that the publishing site is built for disseminating information. It's engineered underneath to have a smaller team of content generators, but then once that content goes out, it's meant to have a large number of readers. This allows you to actually have things very performant. Maybe a lot of times the publishing sites are the root level on your portal as you go into SharePoint, so you can actually make sure that everybody gets the most up-to-date information, and it's built so that you can actually leverage some of the SharePoint capabilities such as targeting content, having filtering, a lot of the searches that are going in there. So this is the ability to kind of have that Bing front page, the Google front page, the Yahoo curated home site, all of those kind of things, but be able to create that inside your organization so that you get the right information out to the right people very, very quickly, and have that information be able to be customized for the role or the identity of the person who's reading it. And then there's the Enterprise Wiki. Everyone loves wikis these days, especially if you've got a team that's really used to working in that mode. But note that wikis do take a bit of time and a bit of discipline to make it put in place. SharePoint has a pretty full-featured wiki. It has kind of started off a little bit slow in previous versions of SharePoint, but it's able to come in, use some of the publishing capabilities of SharePoint, and make the wiki very, very customizable for your organization. Be able to put in those links, to be able to have the right people put in the information, have the people who shouldn't have editing rights put in there, to even be able to have workflows to go in and say, here's a final edit on this wiki page, have approval on it if your organization works that way, or just have it go live as you need it, have comments behind the scenes, and all of those things that you're kind of used to if you're working with wikis. That's the short rundown on the templates themselves. Let's take a minute and actually jump over into SharePoint itself and talk about how we create these sites and what it means when we do.